Hunger turns a man into a predator. But the deadwoods have a way of reminding you where you actually sit on the food chain. I tracked a wounded deer for 3 days through the gray ash. But what I found at the end of the blood trail wasn't an animal. It was a warning. There is a fundamental misunderstanding about starvation. People think that if your stomach is full, you are safe. That is a lie of the modern age. When I raided the tomb of the mummified family in the colonial mansion, I walked away with 80 pounds of preserved calories. I had canned beef stew, chili, peanut butter, and pasta. I thought I had conquered the mathematics of survival. I thought I had bought myself a year of life. I was wrong. I had only bought myself a different kind of death. It took 3 months for the sickness of the tin to set in. The summer heat had finally broken, surrendering to a bitter, damp autumn wind that stripped the dead leaves from the rotting oak trees. My barricaded compound remained secure, and my stomach was never empty. But biology is a demanding master. You cannot run a human machine indefinitely on sodium, processed carbohydrates, and degraded boiled proteins. The human body requires the living chemistry of the earth. It requires vitamin C. It requires fresh amino acids. It requires iron that hasn't been sitting in a metal cylinder for 5 years. The symptoms began subtly. A deep, persistent ache in my joints that made climbing out of my armchair bed an agonizing physical trial. I blamed it on the damp cold seeping through the floorboards. Then came the fatigue. It wasn't the sharp, frantic exhaustion of running from a threat. It was a heavy, leaden lethargy that settled into my bone marrow. My muscles, which I had carefully rebuilt with the calories from the dead family's hoard, began to feel like wet sand. Then, the terrifying signs appeared. I was sitting in my kitchen one morning, staring blankly at the corrugated steel barricade outside my window, chewing on a piece of tough, preserved beef jerky. I tasted a sudden, sharp, metallic tang. It was a taste I knew intimately from the Punji Trench. Blood. I walked over to the cracked mirror leaning against the wall. I pulled my bottom lip down. My gums were swollen, angry, and bleeding sluggishly around the base of my teeth. I pressed a dirty finger against my jaw, and the pain shot up into my sinuses. I rolled up the sleeve of my scavenged flannel shirt. My forearms were covered in tiny, pinpoint red bruises. The hair follicles were bleeding beneath the skin. Scurvy. The disease of 18th century sailors trapped on wooden ships for months without fresh fruit or meat. It was a disease that had been eradicated from the developed world for a century. And now, it was actively dissolving the connective tissue in my body. If I didn't get fresh nutrients, living vitamins, fresh blood, fresh meat, my teeth would fall out. Old wounds would spontaneously reopen as the scar tissue broke down. Eventually, the blood vessels around my heart would rupture, and I would drown in my own chest. The cans of food in my pantry were nothing but a heavy anchor dragging me to the bottom of the ocean. I needed to hunt. It was a terrifying proposition. The suburbs were a wasteland of concrete, rusted metal, and toxic ash. The wildlife had been annihilated by the electromagnetic pulse, the subsequent radiation from the burning cities, and the frantic overhunting by starving mobs in the first few months. The only animals left were feral dogs, diseased rats, and crows that fed on the dead. Eating any of those was a gamble with cholera or parasites. But staying inside the compound was a guaranteed death sentence. I began to expand my daily patrols. I moved differently now. I wasn't just a scavenger looking for abandoned pantries. I was a predator looking for a heartbeat. I left the Mossberg shotgun slung across my back. A shotgun is a weapon of defense and intimidation. It is devastating at close range, but it is deafeningly loud. If I fired a 12-gauge shell in the dead quiet of the ruined world, every starving survivor within 3 miles would hear the dinner bell. Instead, I carried a weapon I had found weeks earlier in the garage of a neighboring house. A high-end, carbon fiber compound bow. It had belonged to a suburban weekend warrior. It came with a quiver of 4 broadhead arrows, razor-sharp, tri-blade hunting tips designed to cause massive internal bleeding. I had spent hours in my backyard, firing the arrows into a stack of old phone books until my fingers bled, relearning the muscle memory, calibrating the sights. It was a silent, lethal instrument. It was mid-November when the miracle happened. I was patrolling the edge of a large, overgrown municipal park that bordered the affluent neighborhoods. The park had once been a manicured expanse of soccer fields and walking trails. Now it was a wild, tangled thicket of dead brush and gray mud, fed by the contaminated rain. The air was bitterly cold, biting at my exposed cheeks. I moved slowly, placing my boots carefully to avoid snapping the brittle, dead branches. My joints throbbed with the dull agony of the scurvy. I stopped near the edge of a small, stagnant creek that had overflowed its banks during a recent storm, leaving a wide swath of soft, dark mud. I looked down. My breath caught in my throat. My heart gave a violent, painful lurch against my ribs. There, pressed perfectly into the soft, gray mud, was a track. It was fresh. The edges of the impression were sharp and clean. They hadn't yet slumped or filled with water. It was a split hoof. 2 distinct, elongated teardrops pressed deep into the earth. It was large. Much too large to be a dog. I dropped to my knees, ignoring the searing pain in my joints. I took off my leather glove and traced the outline of the track with my bare, trembling finger. It was a deer. A massive buck, judging by the depth of the impression and the stride length to the next track a few feet away. It was a ghost from the old world. A miracle of biology that had somehow survived the fire, the ash, the winter, and the desperate mobs. It had likely migrated down from the northern mountains, driven out of the high country by the advancing freeze, seeking the sparse, toxic vegetation of the ruined suburbs. I looked up, tracing the line of tracks as they disappeared into the dense, dead thicket of the park. That animal carried 20 pounds of fresh, iron-rich, vitamin-dense meat. It carried the cure to the rotting disease in my blood. It carried life. I didn't think about the risks. I didn't think about the distance. I didn't think about the fact that tracking a wild animal through hostile territory was a completely different discipline than scavenging canned goods from an abandoned kitchen. I stood up. I unclipped the compound bow from my pack and knocked a carbon fiber arrow onto the string. I checked the broadhead to ensure the blades were secure. I stepped into the mud, placing my boot exactly beside the hoofprint. I crossed the invisible threshold. I was no longer a survivor hiding in a box. I was the hunter, and I was not going to return to my compound until my hands were covered in blood. Hunting in the old world was a recreation. It was a weekend hobby for men who bought expensive camouflage gear, sat in heated tree stands, and used high-powered rifles with telescopic sights to drop animals from 300 yards away. If they missed, they went home and ordered a pizza. If they hit, they took a photo for the internet and paid a butcher to process the meat. Hunting in the apocalypse is not a hobby. It is an act of total, desperate warfare between 2 organisms fighting for the same finite resources. I followed the split-hoof tracks into the dense, overgrown heart of the municipal park. The landscape was a monochromatic nightmare. The trees, stripped of their leaves by the nuclear autumn, stood like black, skeletal fingers reaching toward the bruised gray sky. The ground was covered in a thick layer of decomposing vegetation, toxic ash, and sticky, freezing mud. Every step I took was a calculated risk. A snapped twig would echo like a gunshot in the absolute silence of the dead woods. But moving silently was agonizing. The scurvy was actively dissolving the collagen in my joints. My knees ground together without lubrication. The pinpoint bruises on my forearms throbbed with a dull, sickening heat. I tasted the copper tang of blood leaking from my gums with every ragged breath I took. But the adrenaline of the hunt is a powerful anesthetic. I tracked the impressions for 3 hours. The buck was moving slowly, meandering through the dead thicket, pausing to strip the dry, nutrient-poor bark from the dying oak trees. He was starving just like me. He was conserving his energy. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, menacing shadows across the gray landscape. The temperature plummeted, the damp air biting through my scavenged flannel shirt and thermal layers. I was losing the light. If I didn't spot him soon, the tracks would disappear in the darkness, and the cold would force me to retreat to my compound. I crested a small, rocky ridge overlooking a dried-up drainage basin. I dropped to my stomach, crawling the last few feet to the edge, peering through a cluster of dead bushes. There he was. He was standing 80 yards away, near the center of the basin. He was a magnificent, tragic creature. An 8-point buck, his antlers thick and sharp, a crown of bone defying the end of the world. But beneath the crown, he was a skeleton wrapped in dull, matted brown fur. His ribs protruded sharply against his flanks. He was pawing weakly at the frozen earth, trying to unearth dormant roots. To see a living, breathing piece of megafauna in the middle of a dead, irradiated suburban wasteland was entirely surreal. It felt like looking at a dinosaur. It was a beautiful, heartbreaking sight. But I didn't feel pity. I didn't feel a spiritual connection to nature. I felt a savage, overwhelming surge of hunger. I looked at his hindquarters, his shoulders, his neck, and my brain instantly translated the animal into pounds of raw, bloody, life-saving protein. 80 yards was too far for a compound bow, especially with my weakened, trembling muscles. I had to close the distance. I spent the next 45 minutes crawling down the slope of the ridge. I moved inches at a time, sliding on my belly through the freezing mud and the sharp, dead brambles. The thorns tore at my clothing and scratched my face, but I didn't flinch. I kept my eyes locked on the buck. If his head snapped up, if his ears twitched toward me, I froze, pressing my face into the dirt, not daring to breathe until he lowered his head back to the ground. I managed to close the gap to 30 yards. I was positioned behind the rotting trunk of a fallen elm tree. This was it. It was now or never. The light was failing rapidly, the gray turning to a deep, impenetrable purple. I slowly pushed myself up onto my knees. I unclipped the release mechanism attached to my wrist and hooked it onto the bowstring. I raised the carbon fiber riser. Drawing a 70-pound compound bow requires back muscles and leverage. With my body deteriorating from the scurvy, it felt like trying to bend a steel beam. I gritted my teeth, tasting fresh blood in my mouth. I focused all my remaining physical strength into my right shoulder and pulled. The cams rolled over. The string drew back. The mechanical tension locked into place. I anchored the string against my cheek. I looked through the peep sight, aligning the glowing green pin directly behind the buck's front shoulder. The heart and lung shot. The ethical, instant kill. My arms were shaking violently. The green pin danced across the buck's ribcage. I tried to steady my breathing, but my lungs were burning. I had to release before my muscles gave out. The buck suddenly stopped pawing at the dirt. His head snapped up. He looked directly toward the fallen elm tree. He didn't see me, but he felt the shift in the environment. He felt the predator. His muscles coiled, preparing to bolt. I squeezed the trigger on the release. The bowstring snapped forward with a sharp, aggressive thwack. The carbon fiber arrow tore through the freezing air. It wasn't a perfect shot. The violent shaking in my arms, combined with the buck's sudden movement, threw the trajectory off by a few crucial inches. I didn't hit the heart. The broadhead slammed into the buck's upper shoulder, slicing through the thick muscle and embedding itself deep near the scapula. The animal let out a sharp, guttural bleat of shock and agony. He didn't drop. Instead, he exploded forward. The sheer, desperate power of his survival instinct propelled him up the far side of the drainage basin with terrifying speed. He crashed through the dead brush, the arrow shaft snapping against a tree trunk, leaving the razor-sharp broadhead buried inside his flesh. In seconds, he vanished into the dark, tangled woods. I dropped the bow. I rested my forehead against the rotting bark of the elm tree, panting heavily, my heart hammering against my ribs. I had wounded him. I had spent my energy, I had taken the shot, and I had failed to make a clean kill. But I knew the mechanics of a broadhead arrow. It doesn't rely on kinetic shock like a bullet. It relies on hemorrhage. It is designed to cut arteries and let the animal bleed out. I stood up, grabbing the bow, and jogged across the basin to where the buck had been standing. I looked down at the freezing mud. There it was. A splash of bright, vibrant, impossible red against the dead gray earth. It was the most beautiful color I had seen in months. It was the color of life. It was the color of my cure. The hunt wasn't over. It had just begun. And the blood was my map. Tracking a wounded animal is an exercise in obsessive, methodical madness. You cannot look at the horizon. You cannot look at the sky. Your entire universe shrinks to a 3-foot radius of the ground immediately in front of your boots. You become a biological machine designed solely to detect the microscopic anomalies in the dirt. I followed the red thread. The initial blood trail was heavy. The broadhead had done massive tissue damage to the shoulder, and the physical exertion of the buck's panicked flight was pumping the blood out of the wound in bright, frothy bursts. It splashed against the dead, gray leaves. It painted the trunks of the skeletal trees where he had brushed against the bark. It was easy to follow, a neon sign pointing deeper into the ruins of the municipal park. But as the first hour passed, the adrenaline of the shot began to fade, replaced by a deep, agonizing dread. The sun finally collapsed below the horizon, dragging the last remnants of the gray light down with it. The temperature plummeted from freezing to entirely hostile. The wind picked up, a biting, relentless howl that cut through my thermal layers and chilled the sweat on my skin. I clicked on my tactical flashlight, cupping the beam with my hand to keep the light focused strictly on the ground. I couldn't risk sweeping the woods with 1,000 lumens. I didn't want to alert scavengers, and I didn't want to push the buck further if he had bedded down nearby to die. The blood trail was changing. It was no longer heavy splashes. As the buck's heart rate slowed, and as the cold air began to coagulate the wound, the bleeding slowed to a drip. A single drop on a gray rock. A tiny smear on a blade of dead grass. 10 feet between drops. Then 20. I was on my hands and knees in the freezing mud, sweeping the narrow beam of the flashlight back and forth, desperate to find the next microscopic clue. My joints screamed in protest. The scurvy was punishing me for the physical exertion. Every time I stood up, my vision swam with black spots, and a wave of nausea rolled through my empty stomach. By midnight, I was 3 miles from my compound. I was deep in a section of the park I had never explored, a dense, chaotic tangle of fallen timber and overgrown ravines. I had a choice to make. The logical, safe decision was to mark the trail, turn around, and navigate back to my fortified house. I could sleep in my armchair, drink warm water, and resume the track in the morning light. But the apocalypse does not reward logic. It rewards ruthlessness. If I left the trail now, the freezing overnight temperatures might preserve the meat, but they would also freeze the blood droplets, making them indistinguishable from the dark mud. Worse, the scent of the blood was a beacon. The feral dog packs that roamed the ruined city limits were starving. If they found the buck before I did, they would strip the carcass to the bone in an hour. I couldn't risk it. That meat was my medicine. It was my only ticket out of a slow, agonizing death by scurvy. I had shot the animal. I owned its biology. I decided to stay. I found a shallow depression beneath the massive upturned root system of a fallen oak tree. It offered a slight windbreak against the howling cold. I didn't dare build a fire. A fire was a lighthouse in the dark. It meant warmth, but it also meant advertising my location to anything with eyes. Instead, I pulled a thin, reflective mylar space blanket from my backpack. I wrapped it tightly around my shivering body, pulling my knees to my chest, and huddled into the dirt beneath the dead roots. The night was a masterclass in psychological terror. When you sit in absolute darkness in a dead forest, the silence is not empty. It is filled with the phantom sounds of your own paranoia. The wind rattling the dead branches sounded like footsteps. The settling of the frozen earth sounded like the snapping of bones. I shivered violently, the mylar blanket crinkling loudly with every spasm. The cold was a physical entity, pressing against my skin, trying to find a way into my core. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to force my brain to sleep, but the pain in my gums and the throbbing in my joints kept me anchored to the misery of the waking world. I thought about the buck. Somewhere out there in the dark, just a few hundred yards away, or maybe a mile, he was doing the exact same thing. He was huddled in the freezing brush, a piece of carbon fiber and razor-sharp steel buried in his muscle, his life slowly draining into the dirt. We were intimately connected by the red thread of his blood. The predator and the prey, both dying of the same world, both enduring the same freezing night, bound together by a brutal equation of calories and survival. I didn't feel victorious. I felt a profound, exhausting sadness. But the sadness wouldn't cure my bleeding gums. I survived the night through sheer stubborn spite. When the first pale gray light of dawn finally began to bleed through the skeletal trees, I was stiff, frozen, and deeply dehydrated. I pushed myself out from under the root system. My legs barely supported my weight. I spat into the dirt. My saliva was thick and bright red. The scurvy was accelerating. I drank a few mouthfuls of freezing water from my canteen, forcing my cramped stomach to accept it. I folded the mylar blanket and put it back in my pack. I picked up my bow. I walked back to the last drop of blood I had marked with a broken twig. I knelt down in the frost-covered mud. The blood was a dark, frozen crimson. The hunt was entering its second day. The buck was strong. He had survived the night. But he was losing fluid and he was losing heat. I stood up, adjusting the strap of the bow, my eyes scanning the dead brush ahead. I was not going back to the compound. I was going to follow this red thread until it ended, even if it dragged me to the edge of the world. The second day of the hunt was not a test of skill. It was a test of sheer, agonizing attrition. Hunting is often romanticized as a chess match between man and nature, a battle of wits and senses. But when you are suffering from advanced scurvy and haven't eaten a warm meal in months, it is simply an equation of misery. Which organism will suffer total organ failure first? The man with rotting gums, or the beast with a razor blade lodged in its shoulder? I followed the trail as the pale morning light struggled to pierce the dense, gray canopy of the dead park. The blood drops were no longer bright red. The freezing overnight temperatures had oxidized the hemoglobin, turning the spots into dark, almost black flecks against the frost-covered mud and dead leaves. It took total obsessive concentration to differentiate a drop of coagulated blood from a piece of dark fungus or a shadowed pebble. Every 50 yards I had to stop. The physical mechanics of my own body were breaking down. The lack of vitamin C was actively dismantling the collagen that held my joints and blood vessels together. My knees felt as though they were filled with crushed glass. Every time I crouched to inspect a suspected blood drop, the effort of standing back up sent a wave of dizzying black nausea rolling through my skull. My breathing was shallow and ragged, a wet, rattling sound in the absolute silence of the woods. I spat into the dirt frequently. The saliva was thick and rust-colored. I was bleeding internally, a slow leak in the plumbing of a dyeing machine. By late morning I found it. It was a dense thicket of dead blackberry brambles at the bottom of a steep ravine. The frost on the ground had been melted away in a wide oval shape. In the center of the melted frost was a large dark pool of congealed blood, soaking into the dead earth. The buck had bedded down here during the night. I knelt beside the depression, taking off my glove to press my bare palm against the dirt. It was cold. He had been gone for hours. He had laid here in the freezing dark, bleeding, his body trying desperately to heal a wound that was mechanically designed to stay open. The carbon fiber shaft had likely broken off on a tree, but the tri-blade broadhead was still buried deep in his shoulder muscle. Every step he took forced the razor edges to slice into fresh tissue, ensuring the hemorrhage never stopped. It was a cruel, horrific mechanism. I had introduced a piece of ruthless geometry into his biology. But as I looked at the massive pool of blood, I didn't feel triumph. I felt a terrifying awe. An animal shouldn't be able to lose that much blood and keep walking. A human being would have gone into hypovolemic shock and died quietly in the brambles. But the buck had gotten up. He had pushed his massive, starving frame out of the depression and continued into the labyrinth of the dead woods. The sheer, incomprehensible will to live possessed by wild things is humbling. It made my own struggles in the fortified compound feel soft and pathetic. I stood up, swaying slightly as the blood rushed from my head. I leaned against my compound bow like a walking stick. The trail led up the steep side of the ravine. I looked at the incline. It was perhaps 40 feet of loose dirt, jagged rocks, and dead roots. In the old world, it would have been a minor scramble. Today, it looked like Mount Everest. I strapped the bow across my back and began to climb. It was an ugly, desperate ascent. I crawled on my hands and knees, my fingers digging into the freezing mud, hauling my dead weight upward. The pinpoint bruises on my forearms ached violently as I scraped them against the rocks. Halfway up, a dead root snapped under my boot, and I slid backward, tearing the fingernails on my left hand as I scrambled to arrest the fall. I lay face down in the dirt, my chest heaving, the taste of copper thick in my mouth. I wanted to close my eyes. I wanted to let the cold numb the pain in my joints. The phantom voice of the emergency radio echoed faintly in the back of my mind, a ghost whispering that I should have stayed indoors. I pictured the cans of beef stew sitting neatly in my pantry. I pictured the mummified family at their mahogany table. No, I rasped into the mud. I forced my eyes open. I dug my bleeding fingers back into the frozen earth and pulled. I dragged myself over the lip of the ravine, collapsing onto the flat ground above. I rolled onto my back, staring up at the bruised gray sky, gasping for air. I lay there for 10 minutes, waiting for my heart rate to slow, waiting for the black spots to fade from my vision. When I finally sat up and rolled over to check the ground, the dark, frozen flecks of blood were there, leading deeper into the unknown territory. The buck was winning the war of attrition. He was dragging me away from my safety, pulling me deeper into the wasteland, testing the limits of my broken biology against his. I unslung the bow, wiped the fresh blood from my split lip, and followed him into the gray. The encounter with the feral dogs had cost me precious time and an immeasurable amount of adrenaline. When the chemical surge faded, the crash was devastating. My body felt as though it were made of wet ash. Every step was a negotiation with gravity. The scurvy was no longer just an ache. It was a structural failure. My vision was tunneling, the edges of the dead woods blurring into a gray, swimming haze. I forced myself back onto the blood trail. The buck was failing too. I could read the story of his exhaustion in the mud. The tracks were no longer evenly spaced. He was dragging his right front hoof, the side where my broadhead had buried itself in his shoulder muscle. The blood drops were closer together now, mixing with frothy, white foam. The arrow had finally worked its way deep enough to puncture the top of a lung. He was drowning from the inside. It was a race to the bottom, and we were both in the final sprint. The afternoon light began to fail, the bruised sky darkening into a deep, oppressive charcoal. The wind died completely, leaving the woods in a suffocating, absolute silence. The temperature plummeted, freezing the mud into hard, jagged ridges that twisted my ankles with every step. I was operating on pure, primal instinct. My higher cognitive functions had shut down. I didn't think about the compound. I didn't think about the mummified family. I only thought about the red thread. I was a biological machine programmed to follow the iron scent of blood until the engine finally seized. I crested a steep, rocky incline, pulling myself up by the exposed roots of a dead birch tree. I looked down into a small, bowl-shaped clearing surrounded by dense, thorny briars. My heart stopped. There it was. The 8-point buck. He was lying on his side in the center of the clearing, his massive antlers tangled in the dead vines. He wasn't moving. There was no rise and fall of his rib cage. His dull, brown coat was dusted with a fine layer of white frost. He was dead. The sheer, overwhelming wave of relief that crashed over me was powerful enough to bring me to my knees. I dropped the heavy compound bough into the frozen dirt. I let out a ragged, sobbing breath that tasted like copper and dust. I had done it. I had beaten the starvation. I had beaten the disease. I had tracked a wild animal for 2 days through a hostile, irradiated wasteland, and I had won. Lying in that clearing was 20 pounds of fresh, living chemistry. It was iron. It was protein. It was vitamin C locked in the organs. It was the cure. I didn't care about the cold anymore. I didn't care about the feral dogs. I pulled my heavy hunting knife from the sheath on my thigh. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely grip the handle, but it didn't matter. I just needed to reach the carcass. I needed to cut into the liver and consume it raw to immediately halt the breakdown of my connective tissue. I scrambled down the incline, sliding on the loose rocks, my eyes locked on the prize. I reached the buck. I dropped to my knees in the freezing mud beside the massive animal. The smell of the carcass, earthy and raw, filled my nostrils. It was the smell of salvation. I reached out to grab the buck's shoulder, to roll him onto his back so I could open the abdominal cavity. But as my hand touched the fur, my brain registered a catastrophic anomaly. The fur was cold. Ice cold. That didn't make sense. The blood trail I had been following was fresh. The frothy lung blood on the leaves at the top of the ridge hadn't even fully frozen yet. The animal should have been dead for less than an hour. The core temperature of a 200-pound mammal takes hours to dissipate, even in this weather. I looked closer at the carcass. The geometry was wrong. The buck was lying on its side, but its head was twisted at an unnatural angle. I looked at the neck. My breath caught in my throat. There was a massive, gaping laceration across the buck's throat. It was a clean, surgical cut, severing the jugular and the windpipe entirely. It wasn't the jagged, tearing wound of a feral dog. It wasn't a puncture from a branch. It was a knife wound. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog of my exhaustion. I scrambled backward, crab walking away from the carcass, my eyes frantically scanning the body. I looked at the buck's back. The hide along the spine had been peeled open, folded back with expert precision. The backstraps, the two thick, nutrient-dense strips of muscle that run along the vertebrae, the absolute best meat on the animal, were gone. They had been completely excised. Someone had beaten me here. Someone had found my dying buck, slit its throat to bleed it out quickly, harvested the highest calorie meat, and left the rest to rot. I looked at the mud around the carcass. There were no dog tracks. There were boot prints. Large, heavy, deeply treaded military-style boot prints. They were pressed deeply into the freezing mud, circling the deer. I wasn't the only hunter in the woods. I had spent 2 days tracking the deer, entirely focused on the ground, completely oblivious to the fact that something else was watching the same trail. I stared at the surgically removed backstraps. The cuts were flawless. Whoever did this wasn't a starving scavenger hacking away with a piece of broken glass. They were calm. They were skilled. They had a razor-sharp blade, and they knew exactly how to use it. I looked up. The clearing was surrounded by the high ridge and the dense, thorny briars. It was a bowl. It was a trap. I was sitting in the exact center of an open clearing on my knees, holding a hunting knife, completely exposed. The adrenaline hit me like a lightning strike, burning away the scurvy, burning away the exhaustion. I was no longer the apex predator. I had just walked blindly onto another monster's dinner plate. In the wild, when a smaller predator realizes it has stumbled into the territory of a larger one, the instinct is to freeze. Movement attracts the eye. Panic triggers the chase. I froze. I stayed on my knees in the mud next to the mutilated buck, my breathing so shallow it barely moved my ribcage. I didn't turn my head. I moved only my eyes, scanning the tree line, sweeping the dark, tangled shadows of the briars surrounding the clearing. The silence of the woods was no longer empty. It was heavily, terrifyingly occupied. The boot prints in the mud were fresh. The edges of the tread marks hadn't frosted over yet. Whoever had harvested the backstraps had been here mere minutes before I stumbled down the ridge. They had heard me coming. They had heard my ragged, pathetic gasping. They had heard the rocks sliding under my boots. They hadn't run away. Highly skilled predators don't abandon a 200-pound carcass just because they hear a noise. They fade into the brush. They observe. They evaluate the threat. He was out there, right now, watching me through the skeletal branches. I slowly, agonizingly tightened my grip on the handle of my hunting knife. My compound bow was lying in the dirt 10 feet away, at the base of the incline. It might as well have been on the moon. To reach it, I would have to stand up, turn my back on the tree line, and take 3 strides. If the man in the woods had a firearm, a rifle, a handgun, even a scavenged shotgun like mine, I would be dead before my fingers touched the carbon fiber riser. I had to assume he was armed. You don't walk through the apocalypse making surgical cuts on megafauna unless you have the ballistics to protect your harvest. I remained perfectly still. I waited for the crack of a gunshot. I waited for the sound of a bullet breaking the sound barrier, the heavy, wet thud of lead tearing through my chest. 10 seconds passed. Then 30. Then a full minute. Nothing happened. The shadows deepened as the last light of the day bled out of the sky. The temperature continued to drop. Why wasn't he shooting? If I was an intruder on his kill, the logical, brutal math of the new world dictated that he should eliminate me. I was a competitor. I was a risk. Unless he didn't have a gun. Or unless he was conserving ammunition. Or unless he was studying me. He was looking at a filthy, emaciated man with bleeding gums, shivering in the mud over a dead deer. He was looking at a creature that had been broken by the world. He didn't see a threat. He saw a pathetic, dying scavenger. He was waiting to see what I would do. I had to change the dynamic. I had to project danger or at least unpredictability. I slowly raised my left hand, keeping my right hand tight on the knife. I wiped the mixture of frozen snot and blood from my upper lip. Then I spoke. I didn't yell. I didn't scream a challenge. I spoke in a low, level, conversational tone, projecting my voice across the dead clearing. I tracked this buck for 2 days, I said. My voice was a harsh, dry rasp, cracking in the cold air. I put the broadhead in his shoulder. He belongs to me. The woods absorbed the words. The silence that followed was absolute. No wind. No rustling leaves. No answer. You took the backstraps, I continued, keeping my eyes locked on the darkest cluster of pines on the ridge. That's a fair tax for finishing him off. Keep them. But the organs and the quarters are mine. I'm taking them and I'm walking away. We don't have to do this the hard way. It was a bluff. A desperate, pathetic bluff. I was claiming ownership while kneeling in the mud, outgunned and outmaneuvered. I waited. I strained my ears for the slightest sound. A shifted boot. A drawn breath. Crack. It was a small sound. A single dry twig snapping under the weight of a heavy boot. It came from the ridge to my left, directly above the path I had taken into the clearing. He had flanked me. While I was staring at the deer, paralyzed by fear, he had moved silently through the brush, circling my position, cutting off my only known exit route. He was a ghost. I slowly turned my head toward the sound. I couldn't see him. The shadows were too thick. But I could feel the weight of his gaze. It was a heavy physical pressure pressing against the base of my skull. I'm standing up now, I announced to the shadows. I planted my left boot in the mud and pushed myself up. My knees popped loudly in the quiet. My head swam with vertigo, the scurvy demanding I lie back down and die. I locked my legs, forcing myself to stand tall. I held the hunting knife down at my side, the blade angled slightly outward. I didn't reach for the bow. I slowly stepped over the carcass of the buck. I knelt by the animal's abdomen. I kept my eyes locked on the ridge where the sound had come from. Using my right hand, I plunged the hunting knife into the buck's soft underbelly. I pulled the blade upward, opening the cavity. The smell of the hot intestines and the raw earth spilled into the freezing air. I reached my bare left hand into the steaming cavity. The heat of the animal's core was a shock to my freezing skin. I felt around blindly, slipping past the stomach, searching for the dense, smooth texture of the liver. I found it. I gripped it tightly and pulled. The connective tissue tore with a wet, sickening sound. I pulled the massive, dark red organ out of the carcass. It was heavy, slick with blood and radiating heat. I didn't pack it away. I didn't wrap it up. I brought the raw, bloody organ to my face, and I took a massive bite. The taste was overwhelming. It was copper, iron, and the raw, unfiltered essence of life. The blood ran down my chin, mixing with the dirt in my beard. I chewed the raw meat, my swollen gums screaming in agony, and I swallowed it down. I took another bite. And another. I was eating the cure right in front of the invisible man in the woods. I was showing him exactly what I was capable of. I was showing him that I wasn't a civilized man playing in the woods. I was an animal, and I would eat my prey raw while looking my executioner in the eye. I ripped a third bite from the liver, chewing with my mouth open, the blood staining my teeth. "Your tax is paid," I said, my mouth full of raw meat, the blood dripping from my chin onto my flannel shirt. "I'm taking the rest." I stared into the dark pines. I waited for the bullet. The standoff in the freezing clearing stretched until the edges of my vision began to vibrate with exhaustion. I knelt in the mud, my chin slick with the buck's blood, the raw liver heavy and hot in my cramping stomach. I stared into the impenetrable darkness of the pine ridge, daring the invisible man to pull the trigger. I was a madman challenging a sniper with a mouthful of raw meat. I waited for the supersonic crack of a rifle. I waited for the flash of muzzle fire. Instead, I heard the subtle, distinct sound of a tactical withdrawal. It wasn't a panicked retreat. It was the deliberate, controlled movement of someone who knew exactly how to navigate a dead forest without breaking twigs or rustling dry leaves. It was the faint whisper of heavy fabric brushing against pine needles, slowly fading up the ridge and away from the clearing. He was leaving. The man with the surgical knife and the heavy boots had calculated the variables. He had already secured the highest value meat, the backstraps, without expending a single bullet. He looked at the deranged, starving animal eating raw organs in the mud, and he decided that a confrontation wasn't worth the expenditure of ammunition or the risk of a close-quarters knife fight. I wasn't a threat to him. I was a biohazard. He abandoned the rest of the carcass to me, not out of mercy but out of pure, cold efficiency. The heavy, physical pressure of his gaze slowly evaporated from the back of my neck. I didn't immediately stand up. I stayed on my knees for another 5 minutes, my heart hammering a chaotic rhythm against my ribs, until the absolute silence of the woods returned to normal. When I was certain I was alone, the adrenaline crash hit me with the force of a freight train. My shoulders slumped. The hunting knife slipped from my numb fingers, dropping into the frozen mud. I dry heaved, the sudden influx of raw, rich protein shocking my shrunken stomach, but I forced my jaw shut, refusing to lose the medicine my body so desperately needed. I had survived the encounter, but the clock was still ticking. The temperature was plunging toward 0. The smell of the open carcass was a massive chemical beacon broadcasting to every predator within 5 miles. If the feral dog pack caught the scent, they would be back in numbers I couldn't intimidate. I had to harvest the meat and move. No. I picked up the hunting knife and wiped the blade on my jeans. Butchering a 200-pound animal on the ground, in the dark, with freezing hands and a single blade, is an exercise in pure butchery. There was no finesse. I started with the hindquarters. The massive, thick muscles of the back legs contained the bulk of the remaining calories. I sliced through the hide, pulling it back from the fascia. The meat beneath was a deep, vibrant crimson, steaming faintly in the freezing air. I cut down to the pelvic bone, navigating the complex joints by feel rather than sight. My hands were slick with freezing blood, losing sensation by the second. I had to use my body weight, pressing my knee into the buck spine, to physically snap the hip joints backward, tearing the cartilage so the knife could sever the tendons. The sound of the thick bones popping echoed loudly in the bowl-shaped clearing. It was a grotesque, exhausting labor. It took me an hour to remove both hindquarters and the 2 front shoulders. I didn't bother with the rib meat or the neck. The return on investment for the time and exposure wasn't worth it. I dragged my canvas backpack over to the carcass. I loaded the massive, bloody chunks of meat directly into the main compartment. The canvas immediately soaked through, turning a dark, heavy maroon. When I tried to lift the backpack, my arms failed. It was easily 60 pounds of raw, dense muscle and bone. On a healthy man, it would be a heavy load. On a man suffering from advanced scurvy, whose collagen was dissolving and whose muscles had atrophied from months of starvation, it was a crushing, impossible weight. I fell backward into the mud, the backpack landing heavily on my chest. I lay there, staring up at the sliver of a crescent moon breaking through the bruised clouds. I wanted to leave it. The temptation to just take one shoulder, to lighten the load and guarantee my escape, was overwhelming. But I thought about the winter that was coming. I thought about the endless gray days trapped in the compound, watching the cans of processed food slowly poison me. This meat was life. This meat was the only real victory I had achieved since the sky burned. I rolled over onto my hands and knees. I grabbed the straps of the backpack. I let out a guttural, animalistic roar of pure effort, channeling every ounce of rage and terror I had stored up over the last 6 months, and hauled the bleeding mass of flesh onto my back. My spine screamed. My knees buckled, but I caught myself on the trunk of a dead sapling. I stood up, swaying wildly under the center of gravity. I picked up my compound bow. I looked back at the remains of the buck, a mangled, hollowed-out ribcage left for the crows and the dogs. I turned away from the clearing. The hunt was over. The extraction had begun. The journey back to the compound was not a walk. It was a grueling, continuous act of physical trauma. I was no longer tracking a blood trail. I was leaving one. The heavy canvas backpack, saturated with the buck's blood, leaked constantly. A steady, rhythmic drip of dark crimson fell from the bottom seam, splashing onto the frozen leaves and gray ash behind my boots. I was painting a perfect, unbroken line directly to my front door for anything hungry enough to follow. I navigated by the weak, silvery light of the crescent moon, afraid to use my tactical flashlight. My world shrank to the 3 feet of ground illuminated directly in front of me. The weight of the meat was a physical torture device. The straps of the backpack dug deep into my collarbones, grinding against the joints, cutting off the circulation to my arms. My hands, gripping the riser of the compound bow, were completely numb, frozen into stiff, useless claws. Every step sent a shockwave of agony up through my knees and into my lower back. But strangely, beneath the overwhelming physical pain, a faint, miraculous shift was occurring deep within my biology. The raw liver I had consumed in the clearing was hitting my bloodstream. It was a massive, concentrated dose of vitamin C, iron, and fresh amino acids. The scurvy wouldn't be cured overnight, but the catastrophic breakdown of my tissues had hit a wall. The bleeding in my gums had slowed to a dull throb. The dizzying black nausea that had plagued me for weeks was replaced by a sharp, burning clarity. I was burning the fresh fuel as quickly as I had consumed it, but it was enough to keep the engine from seizing. I walked for hours. The suburban landscape was a twisted, shadowy labyrinth in the dark. The burned-out husks of cars looked like sleeping metal beasts. The empty, shattered windows of the abandoned houses stared at me like hollow, judgmental eyes. Paranoia became my constant companion. Every time the wind rattled a piece of loose aluminum siding on a ruined house, I flinched, expecting the feral dog pack to burst from the shadows. Every time a dead branch snapped in the distance, I pictured the invisible man with the surgical knife and the heavy boots, tracking the steady drip of blood I was leaving behind. Why had he let me live? The question chewed at my exhausted mind. In this world, you don't leave potential threats behind. You eliminate the competition. Was he just a scavenger, looking for a quick meal without a fight? Or was he something worse? Was he a predator who didn't kill me because he wanted to see where the bleeding animal dragged its prize? I constantly checked my 6 o'clock, turning my head to peer into the oppressive darkness behind me. I saw nothing but the gray, moonlit ash. But the feeling of being watched, the heavy, prickling sensation at the base of my skull, never left me. By the time I reached the highway overpass that separated the municipal park from my suburban enclave, my body was entirely broken. I couldn't lift my boots. I was dragging them, shuffling across the asphalt like a zombie. My breathing was a loud, ragged wheeze. I crested the overpass. I looked down at the dark, silent grid of my neighborhood. 2 miles away, barely visible in the gloom, I could see the jagged silhouette of the corrugated steel barricade that marked my territory. My compound. My fortress. It looked incredibly far away. I began the descent. I didn't walk down the center of the street this time. I hugged the shadows of the tree lines and the ruined fences, moving from cover to cover. If someone had followed the blood trail out of the woods, I didn't want to make myself an easy target in the open street. I crawled the last 500 yards. Literally crawled. The muscles in my thighs finally gave out entirely, cramping into hard, agonizing knots. I unbuckled the heavy backpack, grabbed the top drag handle, and pulled it through the dirt, dragging myself forward on my elbows and knees. The rough asphalt shredded the elbows of my flannel shirt and tore the skin from my forearms, but I didn't feel it. I was operating on a level of primal determination that transcended pain. I reached the edge of my property. I dragged the bleeding bag of meat past the punji trench, past the rusted remnants of David's old fence, and up onto the wooden porch of my back door. I leaned against the heavy oak door, my chest heaving, my vision swimming with red and black spots. I reached into my pocket with a trembling, frozen hand, fumbled for the brass key, and jammed it into the deadbolt. The lock clicked. I pushed the door open, grabbed the backpack, and hauled it over the threshold. I fell inside, kicking the door shut behind me, and reached up to throw the heavy steel bolts into place. I lay on the floor of the dark kitchen, my head resting against the blood-soaked canvas of the backpack. The smell of the raw venison and my own sweat filled the stale air of the house. I was safe. I was behind the barricades. I had brought the cure home. I closed my eyes, letting the absolute darkness of the compound wash over me, and finally, mercifully, I passed out. I woke up to the harsh gray light of late morning filtering through the gaps in the boarded-up windows. My body felt as though it had been beaten with baseball bats. Every muscle fiber screamed in protest as I forced myself to sit up. The blood on my hands and face had dried into a stiff, dark crust. The canvas backpack sitting on the kitchen floor was resting in a wide, sticky pool of coagulated blood that had seeped into the hardwood. But my gums weren't bleeding, and the deep, sickening lethargy of the scurvy had been replaced by a sharp, ravenous hunger. I spent the next 4 hours processing the meat. I dragged the quarters into the bathroom, throwing them into the porcelain bathtub. I used my hunting knife to carefully separate the muscle groups, cutting the venison into thin strips. I didn't have a freezer. I didn't have a dehydrator. I had to use the old ways. I built a small smokeless fire in the living room fireplace using dry, scavenged oak. I rigged a rack of wire hangers above the sparse flames, draping the strips of venison over the metal to dry and smoke. I packed the rest of the meat tightly into the large plastic buckets I had stolen from the mummified family, burying the cuts in heavy layers of scavenged sea salt to draw out the moisture and cure it. It was a massive undertaking, but I worked with a manic, joyful energy. My hands were covered in fat and salt. I was securing my life. By the time I finished, my house smelled like a smokehouse, and I had 50 pounds of preserved, nutrient-dense protein that would carry me through the deepest freeze of the coming winter. I washed my hands in a bucket of cold rainwater. I felt a profound sense of triumph. I had faced the brutal reality of the wasteland. I had competed against feral dogs and invisible men, and I had returned victorious. I was the master of my compound. I picked up the Mossberg shotgun to do my daily perimeter check. I unbolted the front door and stepped out onto the porch. The cold air hit my face, clearing the smoke from my lungs. The street was empty. The gray ash lay undisturbed. I walked down the steps and began to patrol the inside edge of my corrugated steel barricade, checking the structural integrity, ensuring the barbed wire hadn't been tampered with. Everything was exactly as I had left it. I rounded the corner of the house, moving toward the backyard and the punji trench. I stopped dead in my tracks. The shotgun nearly slipped from my fingers. The blood drained from my face, a cold icy dread pooling in my stomach, instantly neutralizing the warmth of the victory. There, resting perfectly in the center of the wooden stump I used as a chopping block, was an object. It hadn't been there yesterday. It hadn't been there when I dragged myself onto the back porch in the middle of the night. I walked forward slowly, my eyes locked on the stump. It was my broadhead arrow. The carbon fiber shaft had been snapped off clean, leaving only about 6 inches of arrow attached to the razor-sharp, tri-blade hunting tip. The steel blades were heavily stained with the dried blood of the 8-point buck. But that wasn't the terrifying part. The terrifying part was how it was presented. The broadhead was driven deep, point first, directly into the dead center of the solid oak stump. It had been slammed into the wood with immense, deliberate force, standing perfectly straight up like a gruesome monument, and pressed into the soft, freezing mud right beside the stump was a single, fresh footprint. A large, heavy, deeply treaded military-style boot print. My breath caught in my throat. I spun around, raising the shotgun, sweeping the barrel across the top of my barricades, checking the roof lines of the neighboring houses. There was no one there. The suburbs were completely silent. But the message was deafeningly loud. The invisible man hadn't just let me walk away from the clearing. He had followed me. He had tracked my bleeding, exhausted, pathetic crawl all the way back to the suburbs. He had stood in the dark, watching me drag the meat onto my porch. He had waited until I was passed out inside, and then he had effortlessly bypassed my perimeter, walked right up to my chopping block, and left my own weapon as a calling card. He didn't want my food. He didn't want my compound. He wanted me to know that my fortress was an illusion. He wanted me to know that the corrugated steel, the deadbolts, and the punji trench were nothing but a child's playground to a true apex predator. He had stood 10 feet from my sleeping body, and he had chosen not to kill me. I reached out with a trembling hand and gripped the broken shaft of the arrow. I pulled. It was driven so deep into the oak that I had to use both hands and plant my foot on the stump to wrench it free. I stared at the blood-stained blades. The triumph of the hunt evaporated, replaced by a cold, suffocating reality. I had cured my scurvy. I had secured my winter rations. I was alive. But as I looked out at the silent gray ruins of the dead world, I realized the terrifying truth. I wasn't the hunter anymore. I was the livestock, and the butcher knew exactly where I lived. #video end.